Hello, this lecture is going to be about the Kingdom of Benin and the punitive expedition of 1897. And this is my cat Anastasia, since I've talked about her, but she hasn't yet made an appearance. She's very happy right now. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started talking about the Kingdom of Benin. So the last lecture that I posted was on Nigeria. And the Kingdom of Benin is within Nigeria, although it is a separate entity from the rest of Nigeria. And so this whitish area, gray, that you see here called Benin City is the Kingdom of Benin. And if I scroll out, you can see that it is located within Nigeria. It's right here, which is a much larger country in comparison. So we are going to talk about the Kingdom of Benin. The Kingdom of Benin is separate from the country of Benin. The people and the language in the Kingdom of Benin are called Edo. And this is spelled the same way as the Japanese Edo, which some of you may be familiar with, that dynasty period. There are currently about 5 million Edo people. Although it's now part of Nigeria, the Oba's powers are largely religious and ceremonial. He doesn't actually rule his people. The first dynasty that ruled Benin City started in the 900s, and it became a centralized kingdom by 900. So this first dynasty was 900s to 1200s, and it was founded by the youngest son of the sky god. But there was a problem, right? In the 1200s, one of these kings had no heir. And similar to the discussion of the Nigerian king and how he was not Nigerian, I'm sorry, Yoruba. Yoruba rulers, how he was descended from Oduduwa, who is the son of the gods who came to earth. Right, there's this idea of divine lineage. And so for the king of the Kingdom of Benin to not have an heir, this is a big problem. So the elders send people to Ife, right, which is where Oduduwa established himself, right? That's where the divine lineage is. You have the chicken scratching dirt from the calabash, all those things. So they send people to Ife, ask the kings where their power came from, right? And it came from Oduduwa. So then the Yoruba send a prince to the Benin kingdom, and this prince has a son with an Edo woman. And this individual, this son, becomes the first Oba, which, as you'll remember, is the title for the Yoruba kings. It's also the title for the king of the Benin kingdom. I'm sorry, my cat's going a little crazy in the background. So this second dynasty is established with a father from Ife, and the mother is from the Kingdom of Benin. And that's 1200s to the present. And there is a little bit of a break in this dynasty from 1897 to 1914 because the British exiled the Oba. But in 1914, the Oba's son was allowed to return to his throne or his stool. And so it resumed at that time. So Benin City is a medieval city in Africa. It's actually the second largest man-made structure on Earth, and it's the most extensive earthwork in the world. The inner walls and the moat date to the 15th century, and it's quite large, this very extensive earthwork. So the palace has been built and rebuilt numerous times. So the first king ruled in 1440 to 1473. He's considered the first king of the Benin Empire. He overthrew his brother, who was the ruler at that time, and destroyed the capital by fire and then rebuilt. He created artistic guilds, all of these things, and he also introduced something that is very important and is going to come up later in this lecture, which is this this yearly ceremony for the purification and protection of the kingdom. So basically, it's seeking to strengthen the mystical powers of the Oba, the king, and the court. And this is called Igwe. And this is when there are these mystical ceremonies and the king becomes re-energized and honors the royal ancestors. This king from 1440 to 1473, Oba Ewer I, he encourages royal carving, introduces coral regalia as a symbol of kingship. And coral regalia is made of coral, which you are familiar with the concept of coral, I'm sure. And you can see that the Oba is wearing it here around his head as well. So a lot of coral. And this Oba is the first to introduce coral. Only the Oba, the queen mother, and the royal court are allowed to wear coral. So the Oba is in charge of all the coral, and the more coral that you have means that you've been given more coral by the Oba and your status is higher. The reason that coral is unique to the king is because Ewer I stole coral beads from Olokun, the god of the sea. And in order to get this coral, he had to trick the god of the sea. And so that is why it is the Oba's right to wear coral. Olokun is the god of the sea. He brings wealth, health, and beauty. And he's directly associated with white. He is a son of the creator god, and the white aspect will come into play in just a moment. So if we come back to the slideshow that I have in Luna, this should look familiar to you. So this is a salt cellar, and this was discussed in one of the first weeks of class, right? We talked about the syncretism of African art styles combined with Portuguese, how these are called Afro-Portuguese. And the Portuguese arrive at Benin City in 1485. And because Olokun is the god of the sea and his color is white, and he brings wealth, the Portuguese were assumed to be sent by Olokun because their skin was white, they brought wealth, and they came over the sea. And so at this point in time, this was not a relationship where the Portuguese are subjugating Africans. They actually approached Africa at this point in time on equal footing. And so there is this lively trade as well as artistic trades, which is how you have something like this syncretism of these Afro-Portuguese ivories. And so in terms of the trade, the Portuguese would receive ivory, like what you see here, slaves, cotton cloth, and spices, right? So again, think about how precious salt is, that you would have an ivory container for salt. And Benin, the Kingdom of Benin receives copper, bronze, or brass manillas, which is what you see here. It's a metal bracelet, essentially, that can be melted down for the metal. And in 1519, there's a record of one slave equaling 40 of these. So the Kingdom of Benin was trading slaves. So this could be prisoners of war, etc., who they would enslave and sell to the Portuguese. The Kingdom of Benin, in addition to these manillas, also received coral, red felt. Red is a symbol of power, so this was important. Silk, black pepper, which had ceremonial uses, and weapons and gunpowder. And these manillas, these metals, were melted down to decorate the palace walls, make the statuary heads, etc., which we're going to see in just a moment. In terms of the ivory that was traded, the king actually has a monopoly on ivory, as well as coral and metal. Ivory cannot be sold without the Oba's permission, and it's associated with the Obas, as well as the fact that for every elephant that is killed, the Oba receives one of the tusks. So 50% of the ivory in every kill would belong to the Oba. All right, so couple of ivory objects that I want to talk about. So this is from the mid to late 18th century. It's made of ivory, and what you see here is an Oba supported by attendants. And the texturing that you're seeing here is intended to depict coral. So you can see how there is this almost like a wall of beads, which if you look here at the Oba, you can see that this is still practiced, this regalia, form of regalia. And so this is a pectoral plaque, so it would have been worn on the chest. We have a couple of examples of early ivory sculptures and portraits. This one is particularly famous, and this is a pendant mask of an Ioba. So Ioba is the queen mother, so the mother of the king. And queens are very important, queen mothers. And so this is actually a relatively small 16th century sculpture. There's one in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and there's one in the British Museum. And what we're looking at, let's see, is you can see that it's very three-dimensional. But then if you look at the figures surrounding this central face, which is, again, a portrait, an idealized portrait, but essentially a portrait, what you're seeing here are faces. So these would be Portuguese because they have facial hair. You do not see Africans depicted with facial hair. And mudfish. So mudfish are able to exist on land or in water. So they exist within two realms. And so they're seen as a symbol of the king because the king exists with humans, but is also divine. And it is white, right? The color of ivory. So again, this is associated with Olokun, who is related to the Oba, right? The spiritual counterpart of Oba, the Oba. So this is an Ioba, right? So you can see how it's spelled here on the right, I-Y-O-B-A, and Oba is spelled O-B-A, so mother of the Oba. Okay, here is the example at the British Museum. All right, another small, not ivory, but somewhat similar depiction of a king. And then let's see, here we go. Okay, so I want to talk about the sword and then I'll talk about the plaques. So this is called an ebon sword. It's ceremonial, it's not for warfare, and it tends to be either leaf or fan shaped. And similar to what we saw in Ghana, where they had the processions, right? And these objects would be processed. This sword is used in a similar fashion. It's ceremonial, it's processed, and chiefs would dance their swords. So chiefs would both throw and catch swords in this coordinated dance. And so the higher a chief's status, the more skill and imagination they have to display in tossing, and performing the sword, and they cannot drop the sword. If they do drop the sword during their performance, there are fines and disgrace follows. And so you can see it here depicted really well. And so these swords are pretty common objects. Now, in terms of the plaque itself, this is, this is one of the most famous art forms of the Kingdom of Benin. This and the heads of Obas and Iobas are the most well known. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Sorry, hang on. Sorry about that, I hit the wrong button before. Okay, so we're going to look at a few of these different plaques just so you can kind of see. There's a lot of variety, but they do tend to have similarities, right? So they often have this kind of flat but textured background with a heavily raised figure, whether that is single or accompanied by attendants, typically an oba, but not always. So these plaques are made of lost wax casting, which is where you make something out of wax and then you surround it with, say, clay, and then you heat it enough to melt the wax so that it leaves a negative space. And then you can pour the metal in there and then break the clay off, and you're left with a metal object, however thick that wax in between the layers of clay was. And these plaques would have covered the wooden beams supporting the roof in the royal palace. And we believe that they were made in pairs. So these are depicting both history and mythology. And so what we're seeing here are obas. You can see that this is 16th, 18th century again, right? Notice this coral regalia. Here we see a depiction of the Portuguese. Okay, so they are depicting history. You can see the manillas that I just showed you, right? So this very valuable form of trade for the Edo people. Some of these date to the 16th century, so 1500s and later. So this is a very long tradition that goes back quite a ways. And here you can see a plaque that is different in that it has open work, and the oba is depicted with attendants, but the oba's legs split out like a mudfish. Okay, so these plaques are very famous. Most big museums that you go to, whether it's a natural history museum or an art museum, will likely have a plaque. These are some metal figures, as you can see. But what I want to talk to you about is the commemorative heads, or head of an oba. So again, this is lost wax casting. And lost wax casting was introduced in the Kingdom of Benin in the 14th century by an Ife bronze caster. And so ever since then, they've made these memorial heads out of metal. And these are highly technically skilled. It's a very, very thin wall. I believe it's maybe like a centimeter thick. I'm not entirely sure, but it is quite thin. It takes a lot of technical skill to produce these. And so what you're seeing here is the face of the king wearing a coral hat with coral strands and a somewhat restrained coral necklace. And these figures are idealized, but there are enough distinct features that they're believed to be actual portraits, not just a representation of a king. In the early work, so this one is 16th century, it's roughly 1550. The coral tends to be somewhat restrained. There's not a ton. For these heads, the eyes are often pierced, and there will be lead inlays, whether in the forehead or in the eyes, for these objects. And the brows, the marks in the brows will often be made of iron, which indicates strength of character. So only copper, bronze, and brass can be used in making the head of an oba or an ioba, the mother of an oba. Chiefs can also have these commemorative heads, but those are made of terracotta. Guild members, so the artistic guild, can have these made of wood, etc. But the metal is reserved for royalty. And these heads would be commissioned by the enstooled or enthroned, right? Because you also have this idea of the stool being important, as we saw with the Ashanti people. The enstooled oba would commission one of these to commemorate the previous oba, who's likely the father. And these heads specifically focus on the head, obviously, as the center of thought and judgment, right? You have the senses surrounding the head, except for touch, wisdom, life force, right? Also similar to the Yoruba, the concept of the ori inu, the inner head, right? The soul. So all of these make the head a very natural element to commemorate the previous oba. So in terms of dating these, William Fagg, who we saw with the knock heads, the very ancient heads from Nigeria, he's the one who came up with the dating system, and through the 16th century, these tend to be very thinly cast. You have this rather refined coral. You'll have hair that's in strands, iron only, and something that is consistent across all the periods of these heads is that they are in fact hollow, and there's a hole in the top of the head. I think I have an image. Yeah, so this shows you pretty well. This is a head of an oba, and you can see that there is a hole in here. And that is so that you can place a tusk inside the head and it will spring out. In terms of the dating of these heads, the 17th and 18th century is the middle period. So this is still early. You can see this stepped hairstyle, the much more refined, restrained amount of coral. You can see the inlays in the forehead that I talked about. And then this is a middle period head of an oba, so 17th to 18th century. You're starting to see more coral. So you have a lot more coral to the point where it actually starts to come up to the chin of the head, of the king, sorry. The features become slightly more abstracted, etc. And then the late works, they actually add a lip in order, here you can see it, in order to balance the weight. The coral is all-encompassing, right? It covers even the chin. And you start to see these antennae, which have to do with mudfish. So again, this idea of the king occupying two realms, like the mudfish do, land and water. And mudfish are seen as having spiritual power. And so they are seen also as symbols of the kingdom of Benin. And these are much more abstracted. You can see how something like this looks like it could be a specific individual. This could also be a specific individual, but by the time that you get to this later head of an oba, it is no longer as specifically individualized. There are also heads for queen mothers, the ioba, which is what you see here. And again, this would also have a hole in the back of the head. The hairstyle is different. This is called a chicken's beak. It's long and pointy and then covered with coral beading. And it shows the extension of the ori inu, the inner head, right? So think back to the Yoruba lecture. All right, so these are some heads. The DIA has, I believe it has at least one, I believe. I don't know if it has more. But you can kind of see here a better example of this lip and this all-encompassing coral regalia, these mudfish antenna, and then the hole into which the ivory tusk would be placed. So here is a head of an ioba, so a queen mother, another ioba. And you can kind of see that there is like a flattened place here, and that is the area for the hole for the tusk. Yeah, so you can see it here. So these are decorative, but they also have a functional role. So into the hole in the head would an ivory tusk would be placed. And what you're looking at here is an example of one of these tusks. So as I mentioned before, for every elephant killed, the oba gets one of the tusks. That's the right of the king. So ivory is very valuable. It's white, which is the color of the gods, right? Olokun. And it is bleached so that it retains its whiteness throughout patination. And it's carved in low relief, and it reads from the bottom up in a spiral. So this is actually not just random figures, but this tells a story. It's a narrative. So again, right, you're seeing what are hopefully becoming somewhat familiar imagery. We have this oba, coral regalia all over, legs becoming mudfish. Okay, so killing some kind of animal, maybe, I don't know, it looks like it has horns, right? Look at all of this coral regalia with the chicken's beak hairstyle, etc. Facial hair, so this is obviously someone who is not African, etc. And then the reason that the end of this is blackened is because it was charred in the fire at the palace, and I'll get to that in just a second. So basically, these tusks would be placed into the heads of the oba who is commemorated on these tusks. And so again, right, it's extending the ori inu of the oba, whose head it sits in. And these would be placed on altars. And these altars would have bells placed in front of them, used to summon the ancestors. So think about the golden stool of the Ashanti people and how that has bells on it to summon the ancestors. So there are a lot of commonalities between the art forms across people groups that we're looking at here. So these altars would be, just some more examples of these tusks. The altars would be dedicated to former obas, and in the 1800s, there were anywhere from 25 to 30 altars in use at the time. So there would be a lot of these. And the oba commissions the head of his father, right? And then that goes on to an altar. So been talking about these. This is what an altar would look like. So here you can see a very three-dimensional sculpture of an oba, right? We see the ebon swords, the ceremonial swords, and then we see these heads of an oba, and these are 18th to 19th century. You can tell because of the mudfish antennae here, right? All of them have it. You have the brass bells at the front of the altar used to summon the ancestors. And then you have the tusks that spring out of the heads. So this really gives you an idea of how these objects would be used and what the presentation would look like. So these altars are the center of commemorative ceremonies, specifically the igwe, which I mentioned before. And within the first 3 years of the death of an oba, the new oba must create an altar to honor his father. Okay, so these are altars. This is an example at the Field Museum in Chicago. And so what you see here are 4 heads of an oba, 1 ivory tusk, some bells, and a figurative sculpture. And this is constructed to look like an altar in front of the photograph of an altar, which was taken, I think, about 1970. So I've mentioned a couple of things like the burning of the palace. Again, you can see here in this image, right, this charring of these tusks. So what you need to know is that the Europeans and the Edo were on good terms prior to the 1800s. So I mentioned this, right? The Europeans perceived Africans as equals, and they were perceived as messengers of the gods by the Africans, and it was a positive trading experience, despite the fact that there were enslaved peoples who were sold to the Europeans. But Europe is ultimately interested in Africa's natural resources. This should come as no surprise to you. We've talked about this in class. You're taking an African art history class. And so Europe is conducting these expeditions into the interior of Africa. They are colonizing, they're naming countries for their resources, which is how you have the Ivory Coast. That's literally the name of the country. And then you also have areas that have titles that are not necessarily the official name of the country, like the Gold Coast. So you have this focus on the natural resources to the exclusion of the people there. So the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, is called by Portugal, who wants to divide the continent fairly between France, Britain, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Italy, etc. And so treaties are being signed at this point in time, and the Europeans are tricking Africans into dividing up Africa completely arbitrarily, right? So when we look at the map of Africa, all of these lines are arbitrary, right? So sometimes if you look at an artwork in a museum, you'll see that it says a people group, but then it's not sure what country it came from. And the reason for that is because these lines were drawn by people who didn't care about the ethnic groups within those lines. So these ethnic groups get bisected by these lines, etc. So just completely arbitrary, based solely on what the European powers wanted. So this is all going on, but Benin, the Kingdom of Benin, retains its independence, and the Oba still has a monopoly over trade with the Europeans. In 1892, Oba Overrowan refuses to sign a treaty that attempted to trick him into making the Benin Kingdom a British colony. And so the Oba is like, wow, okay, we're clearly not friends. You tried to trick us. He just kind of backs away. And at this time, he begins engaging in the Igwe, which is that secretive mystical ceremony, almost nonstop. So originally, this was intended to renew the Oba's powers, the magical powers of the Oba, and celebrated between Christmas and New Year's during the ritual season, but would not be performed in the presence of non-native persons. So in 1896, the Oba, puts an embargo on palm oil, and this really irritates the Europeans. And so they ask the British government to open up the territory and exile the Oba, i.e., conquer the territory, subjugate it. So in November of 1896, James Phillips, who's a member of the British armed forces, contacts the British government and asks for permission to invade Benin City, suggesting in a letter to the government that selling the ivory looted from the city after it's overthrown would pay for the expedition. This is a quote from a November 17th, 1896 letter. I would add that I have reason to hope that sufficient ivory would be found in the king's house to pay the expenses incurred in removing the king from his stool, end quote. So he decides not to wait for permission. So he sends this letter mid-November, right? And this is still at a time when there's not a ton of quick communication between continents. And so in December of 1896, late December, he's just like, screw it, I'm going in. He doesn't get permission. He doesn't wait for permission. He gets together a band of English soldiers and 250 African mercenaries, so people who are paid to be soldiers. And he pretends to be a peaceful envoy. And so they approach Benin City, and the Oba sends a messenger who says, hey, we're really excited to see you. Right now, though, we are in the middle of a really sacred mystical ceremony that cannot be conducted in front of foreigners. And so unfortunately, you can't come by now. Maybe later would be great. And so Phillips just completely ignores that and he proceeds. He also has weapons hidden, which the Oba finds out about. And so the Oba attacks preemptively. He ambushes the British envoy. And all the officers but two are killed on January 3rd, 1897. And so the British have been looking for a reason to subjugate the Kingdom of Benin, right? They want those natural resources. They're really irritated that the Oba has withstood all of their pressure, all of this. And so they are actually, they avail themselves of this opportunity, right? Where they can take revenge on the Kingdom of Benin and colonize it. And they can call it a punitive expedition. So what you see here is documentation from 1897 of the aftermath of the overthrow of the Kingdom of Benin. So February 18th, 1897, British soldiers go, they burn the palace, they loot 2,400 works of art, and they exile the Oba. So this is why there's a break in the Second Dynasty from 1894 to 1897 to 1914, apologies. So what you see here are soldiers, and you can see that there are a lot of these ivory tusks that we talked about, other objects that we did not speak about. Look at this. Look in the background. Look how much carnage and all of these tusks, right? So you can understand why many of these tusks were in fact charred. Okay, so you can see them here. And I should point out, oh, geez, that's a head of an Oba. I never realized that. Holy cow. Yeah, so I should point out that these types of expeditions are not exclusive to the Kingdom of Benin. It's just particularly well documented, and the imagery is particularly powerful here. So this is not something that is unique to the Kingdom of Benin, but it is a good example of what happened to Africa wholesale. Okay. So again, right, the British are able to justify this expedition because, well, they killed our soldiers. I mean, what did they expect us to do is kind of the logic behind it. So what you're looking at here, I wish I could like point at the screen for you, but each of these is one of those plaques, right? So the plaques would have been on these poles holding the roof up. You can see that there are just dozens of them. In the background, I believe you're seeing heads of obas. And the smugness, yeah. So the dot pattern is strong on this, but you can see here's a head of an oba, here's another. The smugness on their faces, they're very pleased with themselves. They burn the palace, right? The Kingdom of Benin is now theirs. They have access to all the natural resources. The Oba is in exile in 1914. He dies in exile, and his son is allowed to return that same year and retake the stool or the throne. But it's still being treated as a colony of Great Britain. Okay. So although the Oba comes back into power, it's not truly his kingdom anymore. It's being ruled externally by European powers. And in 1958, the Obas finally reconstruct an altar, which is this image seen here in 1970. So this is dedicated to the Oba who was exiled in 1914. No, sorry, died in 1914, exiled in 1897. So this is what that altar would have looked like. And again, right, you can see images of the punitive expedition. So again, this is not something that is unique to the Kingdom of Benin. It is well documented. There's an alcohol bottle in the front, and you're seeing these very sacred objects depicting the life of divine kingship, simply tossed on the ground. These are seen as curiosities. They're valuable because they are aesthetically pleasing, but they're also made of valuable materials. And so roughly 40% of all the art that was stripped from the Kingdom of Benin and the palace there ends up in the British Museum. So the British Museum is an interesting institution that is composed of art from all over the world taken during colonization and various wars. So hopefully this will kind of give you a little bit of context for thinking about how colonization works in Africa and how we get many of these objects that we see in African art sections of art museums and natural history museums.